r/askreddit. Historians of Reddit, what misconception about history drives you nuts? I think in general history tends to take the emotions out of an event. We look back at a historical event and think, oh my god, it's so obvious. However, for people experiencing fear, uncertainty, and not knowing how things will end, we lose a lot in history. And how slow information was. We see protests and wars happening across the world in real time. They often had to take action on a few rumors, weeks later. I just watched the Vietnam documentary on PBS and your comment is really spot on. I recall learning about the war and the social clashes during school, back in the 90s, which wasn't even that far removed from the late 60s and 70s, but watching that documentary really put the emotion into it. People think today's US is divisive, but back in the 60s and 70s things really were divisive. Listening to the interviews and watching those clips really put the social clashes into a better perspective for me. It makes you think about what emotions cultures went through during other episodes in history that dry textbooks and lecturers gloss over. There are a lot of myths about photography that bug me that people perpetuate. Not every weird looking photo from the 19th century is a memento mori, that is post-mortem. A lot of photos floating around on the internet labeled as such are actually living subjects. And only in the earliest days did photographs take a long time to produce. By the Civil War, exposure times were rapidly becoming comparable to modern cameras. People didn't smile for photos because they thought it made them look foolish. Portraits were supposed to be serious and formal. Not a historian, but Martin Luther didn't set out trying to destroy the Catholic Church. His 95 theses were meant to start a discussion to end corruption in the church, and it kind of snowballed. Edit till Martin Luther was anti-Semitic. My priest was just discussing this the other night. Martin Luther tried to have counsel with the Pope cardinals on several occasions before this even happened. Basically, he said Martin Luther probably would have ended up as a saint and the Protestant reform may have never happened if the higher-ups wouldn't have ignored him. Marie Antoinette never said let them eat cake when she was told French peasants didn't have any bread. That was 100% revolutionary propaganda. Contrary to popular belief, she did give some fugs about her people. Edit. Yes, I know the original quote used brioche and not cake. I can't help that the popular and pervasive translation uses cake. But she's a killer queen. Gunpowder, gelatine, dynamite with a laser beam guaranteed to blow your mind. This is extraordinarily annoying. As I recall, the quote came from an anecdote in the Confessions of a Man who doesn't even name the source, other than to say a princess said, and yet it's now a widely recognized fact that these were her words. Fun fact, in Philadelphia on Bastille Day a woman dresses up as Marie Antoinette and stands on the walls of the historic, decommissioned, Eastern State Penitentiary and tosses Tasta cake snacks into the masses on the streets. The worst thing about her though was the Hameau de la Reine she had built. She used public money to build a peasant farm so that she could play dress up, all the while her people are starving. Never really understood him as quote about cake was used and not this. Amateur historian, but what always bothers me the most is the idea that people in prehistory were somehow dumber than we are today. The truth is, their physiology and their brains are exactly the same as ours today, and they were capable of the same complex thoughts and accomplishments that we are. It pisses me off when bullshit documentaries claim aliens built ancient structures. People are capable today and they were capable then. They found a way. Actually, our hunter-gatherer ancestors were probably both mentally and physically more fit than people alive today. They simply lacked the generationally accrued knowledge we benefit from. Thank you. I came here to say something similar. I have a degree in archaeology and multiple family members that believe anything and everything stated on the various ancient alien documentaries. I had to stop going to family gatherings for a bit because I simply could not stand to be around any of them. They just loved to tell me that I was wasting my time in school, because we would eventually find the proof that aliens were behind everything. That the time we live in now is normal and stable as opposed to back in the day when everything changed every few thousand years. We're living in one of the most fast-paced revolutions in the history of mankind. People have been born before television and grow up with an established internet. Historical breakthroughs are happening on a regular basis. We're sending people into space for the first time. Almost all the people who invented things like the internet, video games, computers, Things that are going to stick around with us for the rest of humanity are still alive. It's insane. It took, what, 50 years for the internet to be invented and reach the mainstream so that almost anyone in a developed country has access to it and reach other people from all over the world via a device that fits in their pocket? That's scarily impressive, actually. With this speed, internet might be as common as water in the future, that you can access it anywhere at any time, no matter where you are. And again, the internet allows to connect to people from all over the planet. That's just mind-blowing. The invention of the telephone was revolutionary for allowing people to communicate with people very far away, but now it's even easier. And you can even do group calls and screen sharing and use face cams. Maybe teleportation isn't such an unrealistic goal after all. This is a bit specific, but the notion that 18th century European warfare was waged the way it was because people were stupid. You know, lining up in a field and shooting each other from 100 yards or less. The military minds of the day weren't mouth-breathing simpletons who were incapable of coming up with anything better. These tactics were well thought out and highly effective when done correctly. Edit. I've gotten a lot of responses and questions about this. Basically, the deciding factor in most battles was the cavalry. The cavalry was highly effective against unorganized infantry, but it was useless against organized and disciplined infantry. Both armies would deploy their infantry in dense lines to deter the use of enemy cavalry. In order to make their own cavalry useful, they would attempt to disrupt the enemy infantry formation by shooting them apart and disrupting their formation enough to bring the cavalry in. There was some more complexity to it, but this is the general overview. Until technology advanced on a large scale, these tactics were sound. I feel like what people don't understand about war in that time period contributes a lot to this kind of thinking. People always forget about cavalry, and how in the face of cavalry charges you'd want to present a massed volley of fire rather than being spread out. People forget about how every single one of those soldiers had to march for days in order to reach a battlefield, and still maintain their unit cohesion. That's a big argument for regimented lines of infantry, the other argument being that it's important that the commanders be able to order units as a unit, and that volley and fusillade fire are way more effective than pot shots. Artillery changes things too. Cannon are heavy and expensive, and so much of the infantry's job was to protect the artillery, and much of the way to win a battle was to establish the better artillery position to be able to either engage the enemy artillery or come right at the enemy infantry. There actually was color photo back in the old days. It's just that black and white was cheaper to mass produce and much more simpler to process, so color was extremely rare. That in the Middle Ages you would not live past 30. Yeah, I hate when people try to tell me you'd never live longer than 30. The average age was about 30, due to people having way more kids than nowadays, many of them already dying during birth, and most of them dying at a young age due to diseases that later became easily treatable, once a basic understanding of hygiene started existing. When you survived your childhood, there's a good chance you'd live till you're 50/60. 45 it's a thing. Edit. You were apparently not invincible when you survived your childhood, till. Napoleon wasn't short. It was English propaganda, picturing him as a short man to make him unimpressive. I read he would be around 1m70 in height. This isn't tall, but it's certainly not short either. For that period, that was even above average. Edit. As you Combat Wombat 1 correctly points out, this was also due to a difference in English inches and French inches, which the English were more than happy to forget as to portray him as a short man. 1m70. Around 5 feet 6-5 feet 7 for those that measure in freedom units such as myself. Edit. Guys, leave Napoleon alone. All he wanted was to rule Europe, not to be rebutted for his height. I bet he'd beat all of you in a duel to the death. Edit 2. Changed American to freedom units. And NGL. I wanted to put rule Europe, but I need to brush up on my history. So I forgot how far he actually got. Ty for correcting me. D. I still bet he'd beat you all 1v1. Edit 3. You guys and your technicalities. If he was alive, I bet he'd beat you in a duel to the death. Same with Hitler. He was of average height. He also didn't have brown eyes. They were reportedly intensively blue, and it's highly unlikely that he only had one testicle, which a lot of people claim. The delegates who attended the Constitutional Convention spent much of their time drinking. One surviving document is a bill for a party on the 15th of September, 1787, 2 days before the signing of the Constitution. Items on the bill were 54 bottles of Madeira, 60 bottles of claret, 8 bottles of whiskey, 8 bottles of cider, 12 bottles of beer and 7 bowls of alcoholic punch. All of this for 55 people. 7 bowls of alcoholic punch. So you're telling me they drank jungle juice? As I've started to look more into my local history, Nebraska, it's crazy just how brutal the plains were. You had Sioux and Pawnee slaughtering each other, white settlers and cattlemen from Texas slaughtering each other, and of course all the interracial violence. Also pretty frustrating how shallow our study of local history was in elementary through high school. There was so much cool stuff that happened that I didn't learn about until I took a history course to fill out my hours this fall. They don't make you take your state's history in grade school. In Texas we have to take an entire year of Texas history in 7th grade. That people didn't know the earth was round till recently. We've known it was round for thousands of years. Hell, some even calculated the size of the planet with some accuracy. So many scientific discoveries are attributed to the wrong people and many others are disregarded. Edit. I'd like to thank everyone who helped make this by far my most upvoted comment. Edit 2. I'm gonna come clean. I'm not a historian. Edit 3. At 2k upvotes was gonna say something along the lines of let's pass 5k upvotes but didn't think it'd happen. Thanks for proving me wrong. What's really interesting is that Columbus had trouble getting financial backing not because they thought he'd fall off the end of a flat earth but because they rightly calculated that he'd never have enough food water to make it all the way around the earth to India. I see this on Reddit a lot, that if a notable historical figure was less than perfect, then it somehow invalidates everything they did. For instance, that MLK may have cheated on his wife somehow negates his accomplishments. This is a good answer, but I think it's justification for why we shouldn't deify individuals in any case. Humans got a human, you know? I think it's intellectually mature to realize humans are flawed creatures, and that no one is perfect. Swords weren't giant steel clubs. Most longswords weighed around 3-4 pounds. One-handed arming swords, even less swords, can't cut through armor or even chainmail. In every movie I've seen, swords chop through armor like it's nothing, and it's really dumb. Edit. 4-5 to 3-4. 5-pound swords would be on the far end of viable weapon. Something like a claymore would be 4-5 and a Zweihander would be above 5. Thank you. Being a huge medieval nerd myself, there are a few things that always irked me. Swords cut things just fine. But not armor. That's what more blunt weapons like maces, flails and warhammers were for, or axes, if you prefer keeping a blade. You couldn't pick up a longsword and know how to use it, just like if you were trained in swordsmanship you couldn't just pick up a flail or halberd and magically know how to use it instantly. Learning how to use the weapons took a long time. A properly fitting suit of plate armor did not make the knight or soldier some clunky, immobile tank. You could still break it, and under certain circumstances, pierce it. But they could still move all the same as well. That Caligula was mad. Given what sources from the time we have, it's unlikely he'd be sent to an institution, but he had a sarcastic and sadistic sense of humor that wasn't the norm for the time. Also, he didn't make a horse consort consul. Consorts consul were elected and not appointed. Our sources from the time says that it was a my horse could do a better job than you comment. That's the problem with many accounts of emperors' lives. The more juicy stuff like making a horse a consul, or waging war on the sea, are usually described in the writings of political opponents or the Roman equivalent of gossip magazines. And even seemingly ridiculous stuff like waging war on the sea sometimes has a plausible alternative meaning, like punishing unwilling soldiers. How the French military ate the butt of so many jokes about failing. Yes, I get that they needed help during World War I and World War II, but if you look at their victories compared to their defeats, it is scary impressive. I think the stigma mostly comes from their relatively quick surrender during the German Blitz in World War II. Many criticized them for not continuing the fight as a nation. Stalin hated them for it and tried to keep them away from peace talks because he did not see them as equals. Edit. For perspective, The British and Russians had a deep distrust of each other. England was figuratively losing its seat at the head of the world order as its colonial empire continued to shrink, helped along, unashamedly, by Roosevelt and the Americans. Churchill was relegated to a junior partner in the US-Soviet superpower bloc that was emerging. But Stalin respected Churchill and the British because they kept fighting and committed to fighting to the last man. England would be treated as an equal in the peace conference. France wormed their way into having a position in the peace conference largely because the Cold War had begun almost instantly after World War II ended, and the Americans and British leveraged France to gain more from the Soviets, specifically real estate in Berlin. But some people may not realize that it was the French that took the brunt of the war in World War I. It was their gallant defense of their homeland in the face of an unprecedented scale of destruction that should be appropriately described as winning the war. They had the second most dead among the Entente powers, and, the first, Russia withdrew from the war before it came to a close. It is a misconception that the pyramids of Egypt were built by slaves. Most of the pyramids were built during the Old and Middle Kingdoms, which there is no evidence of slavery at that time. The pyramids were built by free citizens who believed their pharaohs were incarnations of Horus, the sky god. Being a builder of a pyramid was actually an honor and a spiritual experience. They would even have feasts and party during the building too. For me, people tend to ignore the bigger factors that drive history and instead focus on the actions of one or two smaller events as the sole movers of history. Things like warming and cooling periods, plagues, famines, societal collapses and so forth are the reasons events, and choices by individual people and society, are made. Yes, people have agency, but often the choices they have are limited by the times they exist. The Reformation wasn't created in a vacuum when some guy nailed stuff to a door. World War I wasn't simply an escalation resulting, purely, from when a guy got shot in Sarajevo. Understanding the larger agents of change means we can understand how humanity functions and how much we are a product of the world in which we live. Dates of things and the great men of history are nice, but they should accentuate the bigger picture, not be the picture in and of themselves. That in the American Civil War the Confederate High Command were all some kind of geniuses. It is only McClellan's scared-ass ineptitude in the peninsula that allowed them, Stonewall et al., to look as good as they did. They had more than their share of dipshits. John Bell Hood being the prime example. Also, that the South was winning everything until 1863 Grant coming east. Plenty of wins for the Union in the West and elsewhere before then. It all just contributes to the myth of the Confederacy as some heroic underdog tactical phenomenon. That a majority of Germans voted for Hitler. The most he got in a free election was around 1/3 share of the vote. I've had arguments about this with people who simply cannot accept this, including my sister-in-law who almost attacked me, called me a Nazi, and we've hardly spoken since. That in World War II Polish cavalry charged German tanks with sabers and lances only to be mowed down. Didn't happen. Poland used cavalry, but mainly as a form of mobile infantry. They did in fact use the charge tactic, but only against enemy infantry, and that with success. The rumor that they charged against tanks came from a battle where Polish cavalry charged German infantry, dispersed them, only to be ambushed by armor cars and retreat. An Italian reporter, brought in to see the aftermath, saw the dead horses and made up a story where the cavalry charged tanks with sabers and lances. There weren't even any tanks involved at all. Yeah, you can trust the Italians to make shit up.